"I hired you to cook, not to act as my wife," lonely rancher said to native woman, until her tears. The sun had just begun to rise over the wide, dusty plains, painting the sky with soft streaks of orange and pink. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and wild sage. On the horizon, a lone ranch stood, its wooden fences stretching like tired arms across the land. The ranch was quiet, almost too quiet, except for the occasional call of a distant bird or the soft clatter of a windmill turning lazily in the morning breeze. Inside the house, the sound of heavy boots on worn wooden floors echoed through the empty rooms. The rancher, a man in his late 40s, moved with deliberate care. His face was weathered, marked by years under the harsh sun, and his hands were strong and calloused from work he had done alone for decades. He was used to the silence of the ranch, a silence that had become his constant companion. To him, the wide land was both home and prison. He had no family, no visitors, only the animals that depended on him. And yet, there was a quiet ache in him, a longing for something he could not name. That morning was different. There was a hint of anticipation in the air, something that made the rancher uneasy. Today, a new worker was arriving, a native woman who had been recommended by a friend in town. She was to be his cook, nothing more. He was not used to sharing his space with anyone, and the thought of having another person in the house brought a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. When the wagon rolled up the dusty path, the rancher stood on the porch, watching. The woman stepped down with calm confidence. She was neither young nor old, but there was a quiet strength in her presence. Her clothing was simple, practical for the work ahead, and her eyes, dark and steady, seemed to take in the ranch in a single glance. She carried herself with dignity, and though she said little at first, her calm voice would soon be heard. "Good morning," she said, bowing her head slightly. "I am here to begin work." The rancher nodded, keeping his expression neutral. He was not accustomed to politeness. He preferred straightforward words and actions. "Right," he said gruffly. "The kitchen is over there. Having breakfast." She nodded again and moved inside. The rancher lingered for a moment, watching her adjust to the space. It was strange to see someone else moving through his home, touching his dishes, arranging his pots, and finding her place among the things he had carefully kept in order. It was not that he doubted her abilities. He had heard she was excellent, but he did not yet know how to share this part of his life. The morning passed with the clatter of pans and the smell of cooking drifting through the house. The rancher watched from the doorway, his arms crossed, noting the way she worked efficiently and quietly. She moved with a rhythm that spoke of experience, of someone who had done this work for years. Yet there was a gentleness in the way she handled the food, the way she cleaned the counters, as if she treated the kitchen not just as a place of work, but as a space to create something comforting. The rancher grunted in approval, though he did not say much. He was not a man of many words, and he believed actions spoke louder than compliments, but inside he felt a small stir of curiosity. Who was this woman? What had brought her here, to this lonely stretch of land? He wondered if she had someone waiting for her elsewhere, a family she had left behind, or if, like him, she had come to this place alone. By midday, the sun was high, and the rancher decided to test her patience, or perhaps his own. "The stew is too thick," he said, peering over her shoulder as she stirred the large pot. "I wanted it thinner." She looked up at him calmly, her dark eyes steady. "I followed the recipe you gave me," she replied. "I can adjust it if you prefer." Her tone was polite, without any trace of anger or offense, but the rancher felt a prick of irritation. He was not used to being questioned, even gently. "I don't want adjustments. Just make it as I like," he said, his voice sharp. She nodded and set about changing the stew, moving with the same quiet efficiency as before. The rancher watched for a moment longer, then turned away, feeling a strange mixture of frustration and respect. It was rare for him to encounter someone who could remain calm in the face of his rough words, and even rarer to feel a sense of curiosity about them. The day continued with chores and small tasks around the ranch. The woman moved through them silently, tending to the animals, sweeping the floors, and preparing the next meal. The rancher kept to himself, observing her work from a distance, noticing little details, the way she carefully fed the chickens, the soft hum she made while washing dishes. He could not deny that her presence changed the atmosphere of the ranch, bringing a subtle warmth that had been missing for years. By evening, the sun began to sink behind the hills, casting long shadows across the land. The rancher sat on the porch, looking out at the fields, and thought about the woman who had spent the day working in his home. He did not yet understand her fully, nor did he know if he would. But there was a part of him that felt less alone, even as he resisted admitting it. As night fell, the house grew quiet. The woman had finished her chores and was preparing the simple supper. The rancher watched her from the doorway, noticing the way she moved with care, the way she placed each dish on the table. It was not just food she was preparing. It was comfort, attention, and perhaps a hint of something more he could not yet name. He frowned slightly, unsure of what to make of it. He had lived for years without the presence of anyone but himself and the animals. He had grown used to solitude, to silence, to the harsh routine of ranch life. And yet, in the quiet moments, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps admiration, perhaps a longing he had buried long ago. It was not bold or demanding. It was simply acknowledgement of his presence, a recognition that he was watching. The rancher, uncomfortable with the sensation of being seen, turned his gaze away and muttered something about the stew needing more salt. She nodded and adjusted the seasoning, her movements calm and practiced, but inside she felt the weight of his scrutiny, the tension in the air that made every word, every gesture, significant. She had known that this job would not be easy. She had faced prejudice and suspicion before, and she understood that this man was not accustomed to welcoming anyone into his life. Yet she did not shrink back. She continued to work, quietly, patiently, letting her actions speak where words might fail. That night, as the wind whispered through the trees and the stars began to twinkle overhead, the rancher sat in his chair, staring into the darkness. He could still hear the soft sounds of the woman moving about the house, tidying, preparing for the next day. And though he would not admit it aloud, he felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in many years, the house did not feel completely empty. There was someone here, someone who belonged to this space, not by ownership, but by presence. Sleep came slowly, and with it, thoughts he had long avoided. He thought of the woman, of her calm strength, her quiet dignity, and the way she had entered his home without demanding anything. He wondered if he had been too harsh, too suspicious, too quick to judge. But he also knew that this was only the beginning. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, and more moments that would test the fragile balance of their relationship. Yet, as he finally closed his eyes, there was a small, unspoken acknowledgement of change. The ranch was still lonely, the plains still wide and empty, but the presence of another human being, steady and resilient, had shifted something within him. And though neither of them knew it yet, the first step toward understanding, toward connection, had already been taken. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over the ranch, spilling golden light across the fields and grazing animals. The air was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of dew on the grass. The rancher had already been awake for hours, checking the fences and feeding the animals before the world fully came alive. He had grown used to the quiet rhythm of life here, the predictable order of chores and responsibilities, and he did not welcome interruptions easily. Inside the house, the woman had started the fire in the kitchen and was preparing breakfast. The smell of coffee and warm bread drifted through the air, reaching the rancher as he returned from the barn. He paused in the doorway, noticing the way she moved. Careful, precise, and calm. She did not rush, but she did not waste a moment. Each action seemed deliberate, and even the way she handled the simple utensils spoke of skill and experience. "Eggs," she said softly, setting a plate on the table. "Do you want them fried or boiled?" "Fried," he replied, his voice rough but not unkind. He sat down and watched her work. He could not deny that her presence brought a sense of order to the house, though he would never admit it aloud. He was not used to having someone else organize his life, and part of him resisted the change. Yet another part, one he did not want to acknowledge, felt relieved that the kitchen was warm and alive with activity. As the days passed, the routines of the ranch settled into a new pattern. The woman tended to the animals, cooked the meals, and kept the house clean. She even helped mend broken fences or carry firewood, blending practicality with quiet dignity. The rancher observed her work from a distance, noticing the care she put into everything she did. Still, he remained wary, cautious not to give away any sign of approval. He was a man who had spent most of his life alone. Trust did not come easily, and he had learned to rely only on himself. Yet, the more he watched her, the more he felt the stirrings of curiosity and respect. She was competent, yes, but she also had a way of moving through the ranch as if she belonged there. Not through ownership, but through presence. This unsettled him, though he could not explain why. One afternoon, the rancher decided to test her patience, or perhaps his own. The morning chores had been particularly demanding, and he returned from the fields to find her quietly scrubbing the floor. He frowned. "Why are you on your knees like that?" "Use a mop," he said, his voice sharp. She looked up at him without a flicker of irritation. "This works better for corners," she replied. Her tone was calm, measured, but firm. She had faced harsher criticism before, and she knew how to respond without anger. The rancher grunted, crossing his arms. He was not used to being challenged, even politely, and yet he could not find fault with her reasoning. He turned away, muttering about other chores he needed to attend to. Inside, however, he felt an unfamiliar tug at his thoughts. She had confidence, yes, but also patience, something he had never valued in others before. Later that day, the weather changed abruptly. Dark clouds gathered over the plains, and a sudden wind swept through the ranch, carrying dust and leaves in its wake. The animals became restless, and the rancher realized that some of the fences had been weakened by the storm. He rushed to secure them, calling for the woman to help. She appeared quickly, grabbing a bundle of rope and following his instructions without hesitation. Together, they worked in the rising wind, repairing the fences and calming the animals. The rancher noticed how steady her hands were, how she moved with ease despite the storm. He realized that she was not just strong but also resilient, able to handle situations he himself had found overwhelming at times. When the fences were finally secured, they both paused, breathing heavily and wiping the sweat from their brows. The rancher looked at her and realized, for the first time, that she had not complained once. She had worked alongside him, quietly and efficiently, without asking for recognition or thanks. He felt a strange sense of admiration, though he immediately turned his gaze away, unwilling to acknowledge it aloud. That evening dinner was a simple affair, but the rancher noticed small details he had not before. The way she arranged the plates, the care with which she served the food, even the small touches like a clean cloth under each bowl. He had always thought of meals as fuel for the body, nothing more. But tonight he found himself appreciating the effort, though he refused to say so. As the days turned into weeks, small moments like these continued to pile up. The rancher began to see her in a new light, not as just an employee, but as someone with intelligence, patience, and quiet strength. Still, his pride and habit of solitude made him resist expressing any warmth or gratitude. He would grumble, make sharp remarks, or insist that she follow his way, even when her methods were clearly effective. One afternoon, he found her sitting by the window, cleaning knives and tending to vegetables. She looked up and smiled politely as he entered the room. "The garden is thriving," she said, nodding toward the small plot behind the house. "You have good soil here." The rancher frowned. "I didn't plant it," he said, almost defensively. "I barely have time for the fields." She laughed softly, a gentle, clear sound that filled the room. The land, the animals, it shows. He was caught off guard. Her words were simple, yet they carried meaning. For a moment he wanted to argue, to dismiss the compliment, but he found himself saying nothing. Instead, he moved toward the door, muttering something about checking the barn. Inside, he felt a strange warmth, a flicker of acknowledgement that he had not expected. Despite these small moments, the tension between them persisted. The rancher was not used to having someone else in his space, and he often misinterpreted her kindness as presumption. One morning while she was preparing breakfast, he snapped, "I didn't hire you to talk to me like I'm a friend. I hired you to cook." She paused, her hands still on the counter, and looked at him with steady eyes. There was no anger, no tears, only quiet understanding. "I am here to do my work," she said softly. "I will do it well. That is all you asked." Her calm response stung more than an argument would have. The rancher felt a twinge of guilt he did not know how to express. He wanted to apologize, to explain that he had no intention of being cruel, but the words would not come. He turned away, muttering something about the eggs needing more salt, leaving her to finish breakfast in silence. As the week continued, small incidents like these created a delicate balance between them. The rancher remained gruff and suspicious, but he also began to notice the way she improved life on the ranch. Meals were consistent and nourishing, the animals were well tended, and the house, for the first time in years, felt alive with quiet activity. The woman, for her part, continued to work diligently, never complaining, never demanding. She understood the pride and stubbornness of the man she worked for and chose patience over confrontation. She had faced prejudice and misunderstanding before, and she knew that time and consistency could change perceptions more than words ever could. By the end of the second week, a subtle shift had begun. The rancher found himself noticing her presence even when he did not want to. He realized that the house was quieter without her, that the tasks of the day felt heavier when she was occupied elsewhere. Yet he could not admit it aloud, not yet. Pride and habit held his tongue, and so he continued to observe from a distance, caught between irritation and appreciation, suspicion and admiration. And through it all, she continued to move through the ranch with calm determination. She did not force connection, did not demand acknowledgement. She simply existed in the space, performing her duties with care and dignity, allowing her actions to speak where words might fail. As night fell, the rancher sat once again on the porch looking out at the wide, dark fields. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the faint scent of smoke from the kitchen hearth. He could hear her moving inside, tidying, preparing for the next day. He realized, with a mixture of discomfort and curiosity, that her presence had changed the rhythm of his life. For the first time in many years, the house did not feel entirely empty, and though he would never admit it aloud, he felt the faint stirrings of something he had not felt in a long time. Perhaps understanding, perhaps respect, perhaps the first step toward connection. The sun rose slowly over the ranch, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. The air was still cool, carrying the earthy scent of dew and freshly turned soil. For the first time in weeks, the rancher felt the quiet tension of anticipation. Something about the morning felt different, though he could not say why. Perhaps it was the wind that hinted at change, or perhaps it was the presence of the woman he had come to observe so carefully. The day began with the usual routine. The woman had already lit the fire in the kitchen and started preparing breakfast. She moved through the room with calm precision, chopping vegetables and stirring pots, humming softly under her breath. The rancher stood nearby, watching her work, feeling a mixture of curiosity and unease. He was beginning to realize that he had come to depend on her presence in ways he did not fully understand, yet pride and habit made him resist acknowledging it. By mid-morning, the clouds had gathered, dark and heavy, blotting out the sun. The wind picked up, carrying a faint chill, and the rancher sensed trouble before it arrived. Boo! He hurried to the barn, checking the fences and the animals, and noticed that a section of the paddock had weakened. A fence post had cracked, likely from the recent storm. The cattle were restless, moving nervously and nudging against each other. He called for the woman, and she appeared quickly, as she always did. "We need to fix the fence before the cattle escape," he said, his voice sharp but tinged with worry. She nodded, grabbing rope and tools without a word. Together, they moved toward the damaged fence. The wind whipped around them, and the first drops of rain began to fall. She worked quickly, tying knots and securing posts, while he lifted heavy beams into place. They moved as a team, though neither of them spoke much. The silence was broken only by the sounds of wood striking wood and the low, anxious moans of the cattle. Suddenly, one of the cattle broke free from the small section of fence that had not yet been secured. It charged toward the open field, its hooves pounding the earth. The rancher reacted immediately, running after it, but he stumbled on a loose stone and twisted his ankle. Pain shot through his leg, and he fell hard, unable to rise. The woman was at his side in an instant. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice calm but urgent. She knelt beside him, examining his ankle. "You need to rest. I will take care of the cattle." He grunted, trying to shake off the pain. "I can manage," he said, but she did not argue. She grabbed a rope and quickly guided the cattle back into the pen, moving with a combination of strength and ease that left him in awe. He had faced many challenges on the ranch alone, but he had never seen anyone handle the animals with such skill and confidence. When the last cow was secured, she returned to him. "You need to sit," she said firmly, helping him to a nearby bench. "Your ankle is swollen. You cannot work like this." He scowled, frustrated by his own weakness and by her insistence. He was not used to needing help, and the idea of depending on someone else made him uncomfortable. Yet as she gently wrapped his ankle with a cloth and cleaned a small scrape, he felt a warmth he could not deny. Her hands were steady, and her eyes met his with quiet concern. The rain began to fall harder, and they moved inside the barn to take shelter. He sat on a bale of hay, wincing with every movement, while she tended to the animals and checked the rest of the fencing. He watched her work, feeling a strange mixture of gratitude and unease. For the first time, he realized that her presence in his life was more than convenient. It was necessary. As the storm raged outside, he could hear the steady rhythm of her work, the soft clatter of tools, and the occasional low call to the animals. He was struck by her calmness in the face of chaos, her ability to handle pressure without panic. He, on the other hand, felt vulnerable in a way he had not experienced in years. The realization unsettled him. He had always prided himself on self-reliance, on the ability to manage the ranch alone. But now, sitting with his ankle throbbing, he understood that he was not invincible. The woman returned with a warm cloth to clean his ankle further. She worked in silence, her movements careful and deliberate. "You should rest," she said softly. "I will handle everything else." He tried to protest, but the words caught in his throat. For the first time, he felt powerless, and it was both frightening and strangely comforting. He realized that he had been living in a self-imposed isolation, believing that accepting help was weakness. Yet here was someone who offered it freely, without judgment or expectation, and it felt like a lifeline. Hours passed, and the storm showed no sign of letting up. The rancher found himself talking quietly, more to himself than to her, about the challenges of the ranch, about the long years of solitude, and about the loneliness that had become his constant companion. She listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, her eyes full of understanding. It was a strange experience for him, having someone hear his words without judgment, without criticism. As the rain finally began to ease, he noticed tears glistening in her eyes. He blinked, confused. "Why are you crying?" he asked, his voice rough but filled with genuine concern. "Because you are hurting, and I could not stop it sooner," she replied softly. "I have seen much suffering in my life, and I cannot ignore it when I see it in another." He had always believed that showing vulnerability was a weakness, that tears were to be hidden. Yet here was someone who cried not for herself, but because of concern for him. He struggled to find words, to express the complex mix of feelings rising inside him. For a long moment they sat in silence, the only sound the soft patter of rain on the roof. He could feel the tension between them. Not the harsh tension of criticism or conflict, but a different kind, one of shared experience and growing understanding. He realized that her presence had changed the dynamic of the ranch in ways he had never anticipated. She was no longer just a cook, no longer just a worker. She had become a companion in the silent, difficult work of living in this isolated place. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. I did not expect this," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the barn and the fenced fields. "I did not expect anyone to care so much." She looked at him, her expression calm but serious. "Care is not weakness," she said simply. "It is what keeps people going." He felt a lump in his throat, unaccustomed to such honest words. Pride and habit still urged him to remain stoic, but the storm and the day's events had stripped away some of his defenses. He realized that he had misjudged her, that her patience and quiet strength were gifts he had been blind to. The rest of the evening passed with quiet work inside the house. She prepared supper, and he tried to help, moving carefully around his injured ankle. They spoke little, but the silence was no longer uncomfortable. It was shared, companionable, and filled with the unspoken understanding of two people who had faced a challenge together. As night fell, the rancher sat on the porch, looking out at the darkened fields. The storm had passed, leaving the air fresh and clean. He could hear the soft sounds of the woman moving inside, tidying and preparing for the next day. For the first time in years, he felt the faint stirrings of gratitude and respect. He realized that he had underestimated her strength, her resilience, and her capacity for kindness. And though he would not admit it aloud, he felt a small, unspoken connection forming, a bond forged through shared struggle, quiet observation, and the vulnerability that comes when life itself tests one's limits. The rancher understood, in a way he could not fully articulate, that this was only the beginning. There would be more challenges, more storms, more moments that would test both of them. But now, he knew that he was not facing them alone. And for the first time, the rancher allowed himself to hope, not for grand gestures or declarations, but for something simple, understanding, respect, and perhaps, slowly, the beginnings of trust. The days after the storm were quieter, though the ranch still carried the soft reminders of the chaos. A few fences needed repairs, and the ground remained damp, the earth soft beneath their boots. The rancher moved carefully on his still-healing ankle, grateful for the woman's steady presence. She continued her work as if nothing had happened, tending the animals, preparing meals, and keeping the house in order. Yet the air between them had changed subtly. There was a new tension, one that neither could ignore, though neither spoke of it directly. The rancher found himself noticing her more than usual. The way she tied her hair back, the way she moved between chores, the way she handled the animals, all of it drew his attention in a way that made him uncomfortable. He was unused to paying close attention to another person in such a way, especially someone he had considered merely an employee. He pushed the thoughts away, blaming it on curiosity or necessity. Pride would not allow him to admit that he had begun to rely on her, not just for work, but for company, for stability, and, he realized with some unease, for understanding. That morning the air was warmer and the sun glinted off the wooden beams of the barn. The woman was preparing breakfast, humming softly as she worked. The rancher entered, rubbing his ankle absently, and took a seat at the table. He watched her carefully, his expression guarded. "You didn't need to wake so early," he said gruffly. though he could not stop the concern in his voice. "I like to start early," she replied simply. Her calmness irritated him and fascinated him at the same time. She moved with ease, efficient and serene, while he still felt the stiffness in his ankle and the weight of responsibility pressing on him. The morning passed with routine chores, but a quiet tension had settled over them. The rancher found himself growing impatient with small mistakes, the way a bucket was placed slightly off, or the way a tool was left out of order. His gruffness returned, sharper than usual, though there was no real cause for complaint. The woman worked silently, accepting his criticisms without argument, but he could see the faint tightness in her shoulders, the way she paused briefly as if bracing herself. By late morning he had reached his limit. He slammed the pan down on the counter, startling the woman. "I hired you to cook and do your work, not to act like my wife," he shouted, his voice echoing through the small kitchen. The words were harsh, more than he intended, but they burst out before he could stop them. The woman froze, her hand still on the counter. Her face remained composed for a moment, but then the tightness around her eyes broke and tears began to fall. She did not cry loudly or wail. Her tears were quiet, almost trembling, as if her heart was speaking in the only language left to her. The rancher stepped back, feeling a sudden sharp pang of guilt. He had expected resistance or perhaps anger, but not this. He watched her, unprepared for the depth of emotion in her silent weeping. His chest tightened, and for the first time he realized that his words had wounded someone deeply, someone who had been nothing but patient, diligent, and kind. I didn't mean," he began, but the words faltered in his throat. He was not used to apologizing, not in this way, not for something that felt personal yet so necessary. She looked up at him then, her eyes glistening, her voice trembling slightly. "I am here to do my work," she said softly, "but I am also a person, I feel. I care. I have spent my life being seen as less than, and I will not hide what is true inside me." The rancher felt the weight of her words pressing against his chest. He had spent years alone, hardened by life and by pride, believing that emotions were dangerous, that attachment was weakness. And now, faced with her vulnerability, he realized how wrong he had been. Her tears were not a sign of weakness. They were proof of her strength, of her courage to feel and to remain true to herself despite his harshness. He moved closer, unsure of what to do, unsure of how to express the swirl of emotions he felt. I did not know," he said quietly. I was not thinking. "I did not mean to." His voice trailed off. The words were clumsy, unfamiliar, but they were the best he could manage. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand, looking at him steadily. "You must learn," she said gently, "that people cannot be ordered into feeling, and kindness cannot be forced. I came here to work, yes, but I also came here to live in a way that allows me to care, to feel, and to be seen." The rancher sat down heavily, his head in his hands. The pride he had carried like armor for so many years now felt heavy and meaningless. He realized that his isolation had not made him strong. It had only hardened him and kept him from understanding what it meant to truly connect with another human being. For a long while they sat in silence. The kitchen was warm from the fire, the morning sun shining through the windows. The air was filled with the quiet sounds of the ranch, the low hum of animals, the rustling of trees outside, the soft ticking of the clock. And in that silence, something shifted. The rancher felt a connection, fragile and new, to the woman who had worked beside him and yet had also shown him a mirror of his own loneliness and fear. Finally he spoke again, his voice quieter, almost a whisper. I see now. I did not understand before, but I am beginning to." She nodded, her expression calm but compassionate. "It takes time," she said, "and it takes effort to change, but the choice is yours and mine. We can continue as we have, or we can try to understand each other." He looked at her, really looked, for the first time in weeks. He saw not just an employee, not just a companion, but a person with strength, courage, and dignity. He saw someone who had been patient with him, who had endured his harsh words and suspicion, and who had cared enough to reveal her own heart despite the risk of rejection. I want to try," he said finally. The words felt strange, almost foreign, but they were true. He did not know what would come next, or how this change would unfold, but he knew that he could no longer remain in the place he had built for himself alone. She smiled faintly, a small, quiet smile that held hope and patience. "Then we begin," she said simply, "one day at a time." The rest of the day passed slowly, gently. The rancher remained near the kitchen, helping where he could, though still awkwardly and unsure. She continued her work calm and steady, but now there was a subtle difference. The air between them was lighter, less tense. There was respect, acknowledgement, and a growing understanding that neither could fully name yet. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows over the ranch, they shared a meal. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that is not empty but full of unspoken words and shared recognition. The rancher noticed the way she arranged the food, the care she had taken, and for the first time he allowed himself to appreciate it without reservation. This stew tonight," he said slowly. "It is? Good. Better than I expected." She looked at him, surprised for a fraction of a second, then smiled gently. "Thank you," she said softly. No pride, no bravado, just acknowledgement. It was enough. As night fell, the rancher sat on the porch, looking out at the wide fields, the stars beginning to glimmer above. He felt a strange, new lightness. The storm had passed, the fences were repaired, and the animals were safe. But more importantly, a storm within himself had begun to clear. He understood for the first time in many years that connection, kindness, and understanding were not weaknesses. They were the beginnings of something meaningful, something worth protecting. And though neither of them said it aloud, both felt it. A shift in the balance of their lives, a new understanding forming, fragile but real. The rancher had confronted his pride, and she had revealed her heart. In that quiet moment, the first true bridge between their worlds had been built, one made not of words alone, but of shared experience, vulnerability, and the willingness to see each other as human beings. The next morning, the ranch woke to a soft golden light. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the faint scent of dew on the grass and the faint, earthy smell of the fields. The storm from the previous week had passed completely, leaving the land renewed, the fences repaired, and the animals calm. But, more importantly, there was a subtle change in the house itself, a quiet warmth that had not been there before. The rancher moved slowly, still mindful of his ankle, but his mood was lighter. He entered the kitchen to find the woman already at work, chopping vegetables for breakfast and humming softly. For a moment he watched her in silence, noticing the calm focus in her movements and the quiet confidence she carried. Her presence no longer felt like an intrusion as it had on the first days. Instead, it was a part of the rhythm of life, steady and comforting. "Good morning," he said, his voice softer than usual. She looked up and gave a polite smile, one that held warmth without expectation. "Good morning," she replied. Breakfast passed quietly with small smiles exchanged between them. The rancher noticed the details he had once ignored, the care with which he prepared the food, the neatness of the table, the subtle touches that made the house feel like more than a place to sleep and eat. He began to appreciate these things not just as conveniences, but as expressions of thoughtfulness and care. After breakfast, the two moved to the barn to tend to the animals. The rancher worked carefully, mindful of his ankle, while she moved efficiently, her presence steady and unhurried. For the first time, he felt comfortable relying on her for help without questioning it or feeling embarrassed. They worked together in a rhythm that had developed naturally over the past days. No words were needed for every action. The cattle were fed, the tools organized, and the fences checked. Each task, though simple, felt less like work and more like shared responsibility. Later, while the rancher was repairing a section of fence, he noticed her moving through the yard, tending to the small garden behind the house. She knelt to pull weeds and gently watered the plants, humming softly. He paused for a moment, observing her. It struck him how much life she brought to this place, not just through work, but through her calm presence, her attention to detail, and her quiet care for everything around her. For a long while he stood silently, feeling a growing respect and gratitude he had not felt before. The woman noticed him watching but did not stop. She looked up, meeting his gaze, and smiled gently. There was no embarrassment, no hesitation, only quiet acknowledgement. The rancher found himself returning the smile, a small, almost shy gesture, but one that felt significant. It was a silent communication, a recognition that the other mattered. As the days passed, the routines of the ranch continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Meals were shared more naturally, chores were done side by side without friction, and small conversations began to emerge. The rancher asked for her opinion on minor decisions, like how to arrange the barn tools or which seeds to plant in the garden. She responded with thoughtful suggestions, and he began to realize that her input mattered, not just for efficiency, but for the sense of partnership it brought. One afternoon as they worked in the fields, the rancher paused to rest against a fence post. The woman knelt beside him, taking a moment to tend to the soil around the small plants. He watched her for a moment before speaking, his voice hesitant. You have made this place easier," he said slowly. Not just the work, but everything. The house, the animals, and me. She looked up at him, her expression calm but filled with warmth. "I did not come here to change you," she said softly. "I came to do my work and to live my life honestly. But perhaps the presence of another can make life lighter for both of us." For the first time, he admitted to himself that her presence had changed more than the practical matters of the ranch. She had brought companionship, understanding, and patience into a life that had once been lonely and rigid. And though he was slow to express it, he felt a deep sense of gratitude and respect for her. That evening, after the chores were done, they sat together on the porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. The animals were calm in the pens, the wind was gentle, and the air was filled with the quiet sounds of the countryside. The rancher glanced at the woman, noticing the way the light caught her hair and highlighted her features. He felt a strange warmth in his chest, a mixture of admiration, gratitude, and something he could not yet name. She smiled softly, sensing his gaze. "It is peaceful tonight," she said. "Yes," he replied quietly. "It is better than it has been in a long time." They sat together in silence, letting the quiet comfort of the evening settle around them. It was a silence that spoke of understanding, trust, and mutual respect. There were no grand gestures, no declarations of love, just the simple acknowledgement that they were no longer alone in this life. The ranch, once empty and harsh, felt alive in a new way, filled with presence, care, and connection. The rancher began to ask her advice more openly, and she offered it without hesitation. He started to share small stories from his past, moments of regret, and memories of days when he had felt alone. She listened without judgment, offering gentle encouragement and understanding. Each conversation, though small, built trust and deepened the connection between them. One day, as they repaired a section of fence together, a gentle breeze carried the scent of the garden into the air. The rancher paused and looked at her, a soft expression on his face. "You make things better," he said quietly. "Not just the work, but everything here." She smiled faintly. "And you make it possible for me to do my work," she replied. "We help each other. That is all." It was a simple statement, yet it carried a profound truth. They had learned to rely on one another, to respect each other's strengths, and to share the burdens of life on the ranch. The partnership they had built was not born of words or promises, but of actions, patience, and mutual understanding. As the months passed, small routines became cherished rituals. Meals were prepared and shared with conversation and laughter. Animals were tended together, and the land was cared for with diligence and attention. Evenings were spent on the porch, watching the sunset and sharing quiet moments that spoke louder than words. The rancher began to realize that life was not just about surviving or maintaining the land. It was about connection, companionship, and the small joys of shared effort. One evening, as the first stars appeared in the sky, the rancher and the woman sat together in quiet contentment. The ranch was calm, the animals settled, and the work of the day completed. He looked at her, really looked, and felt a warmth in his chest that was new and profound. I do not know what the future holds," he said quietly, "but I know I am glad you are here. That we are here together." She smiled softly, her eyes reflecting the light of the stars. "I am glad as well," she said. "We have found a way to live and work together. That is enough for now." He nodded, feeling the truth of her words. There were no promises of grand gestures or dramatic changes. There was only the steady, quiet presence of someone who had become essential to his life, and the knowledge that they had built something rare: trust, respect, and the beginnings of a true bond. As the night deepened, they remained on the porch, watching the stars and listening to the sounds of the ranch. The wind whispered through the trees, and the animals moved softly in the pens. The world felt larger, yet more intimate, as if the challenges of the past had cleared the way for something new, something simple and real. The rancher realized that he had changed in ways he had not expected. He was no longer the man who believed that solitude was strength or that emotions were weakness. He had learned that trust, kindness, and companionship were not burdens, but gifts. And in the quiet presence of the woman he had discovered a sense of peace and belonging that had long eluded him. And though neither spoke of love or commitment aloud, both knew that something deep and enduring had begun. It was not the kind of story written in grand declarations or dramatic gestures. It was the kind of story written in small, consistent acts, in patience, understanding, and the quiet courage to show one's heart. As the night continued, the rancher felt a quiet contentment settle over him. He was no longer alone. The ranch was no longer just land and buildings. It was home, filled with presence, care, and the promise of shared days ahead. And though the future remained uncertain, one truth was clear: together they could face whatever came, with respect, patience, and understanding guiding their way. In that quiet moment under the vast starry sky, two lives that had once been lonely and separate had found a fragile, steady connection. It was not perfect, but it was real. And for the rancher and the woman, that was more than enough.